Ladies and gentlemen, if you could take your seats, please. We are ready to kick off, and we are on a very tight time frame because our politicians have to get back to Parliament. So yes, the canapes are delicious, and the beers and wine are lovely as well. But if you could please find a seat. Oh, it's all right. Yes, go hard. I can see a few of you not moving, but the longer we take, the less time we've got to grill our politicians.
Good evening, everyone. In the interest of time, while the last few people find their seats, I will kick off now. Tēnā koutou katoa. On behalf of the Motor Trade Association, I'd like to welcome all of you this evening and thank all of you for making the time to attend the debate. We're here today because the automotive industry matters to New Zealand. Not only do we contribute $5.5 billion to New Zealand's economy every year, but far more importantly, we play a vital role in the everyday lives of every New Zealander. We enable people to get to work, to go to school, to go on holiday, and to visit friends, family, and loved ones. Across the country, people rely on our sector to keep their vehicles safely and efficiently moving. Yet right now, the policy landscape is complex. Questions abound. In the midst of a cost of living crisis, how do we meet our climate change targets while minimizing the strain on household budgets? When it comes to labor stability, how do we ensure that the 60,000 people that work in our sector continue to stay up to date with the latest technologies in a landscape that's fast changing? And with the ongoing upheaval of our industry training organizations, or ITOs, being merged into tipukanga, with our industry's subsequent loss of any meaningful voice in their governance or direction, how do we ensure that the education system continues to meet the needs of the industry that it represents, producing the right amount of graduates with the skills and technical capabilities that we'll need in the future? As climate change becomes arguably the defining issue of our time, our sector recognizes the very important role that it has to play in decarbonisation, and we stand committed to making the changes necessary to make a difference. With the transport sector, the second largest carbon-emitting industry behind farming, and with farming seemingly having become politically untouchable in recent times, more than ever transport risks becoming a political plaything with continuous, very well-intended, but ultimately ill-considered policy changes that cost the taxpayer, possibly move the needle little, and create uncertainty in an industry that actually stands ready to work with government if only engaged in the conversation to begin with. We outlined these issues and more in our manifesto of policy calls that we released in May this year. There are many copies of it dotted around the room. For over 100 years, the Motor Trade Association has represented the very broadest spectrum of our industry. Our members are the businesses that fix, fuel, buy, sell, manufacture, provide parts for, and inspect the country's vehicle fleet, as well as any number of other ancillary services. And that's whether they are combustion engine vehicles, hybrid, electric, or in fact, any other type of drivetrain. The breadth of our membership at MTA I view as very much a strong thing, because it means that we always have to take a holistic view in everything that we advocate for as an association. Often the needs and desires of one particular group of businesses will be at odds with another group. This forces us to always put the consumer and the greater good at the front of mind. So tonight, thank you for all coming. We have the general election coming up soon. Very pleased to say that each of the main political parties has put forward a spokesperson. A very sincere thank you to all of you for agreeing to participate. It's very much appreciated. With that, I'd like to introduce Lloyd Burr, who is currently a political journalist on TV3. Personally very grateful to have Lloyd here to host this event tonight. And with that, over to you.
Lovely. Thank you very much for that, Lee. Thank you very much to the MTA as well for having me and trusting me to do this. We are pretty stretched for time because Parliament is sitting this evening. It's a sitting week this week, the penultimate sitting week, and our MPs have got to go back to Parliament. So there's going to be no intermission in the middle of this. We're going to push it all the way through to 7:50. There might be some MPs, I know that Julianne's got to leave at 7:30. So we're just going to push through. So if you do need to go to the bathroom or you do need to go and get a refreshment, a drink or some canapes or a wine at the back, then just do it. And if there's something that piques your interest, then just pop your hand up. I'll try to remember that you've got a question, and I'll grab a microphone and we'll come to you, because this is all about you guys as well, finding out some answers to some of your questions. We're going to start off by, we call it the elevator pitch. So we'll start off with each of the politicians here. They've got a minute to give you their elevator pitch on their portfolio, their transport portfolio, and you've got a minute to do it. And we've got a bell here. It's going to be a strict minute, and then you'll get another ping 15 seconds after that. But if you're really engaging and you're doing a really stellar job, then we'll just keep it going. So yeah, we'll start with Simeon Brown down the end, the National Party's transport spokesperson.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to be here, and thank you to the MTA for hosting us tonight. The National Party is committed to working with you as an industry because we believe in transportation, motor vehicles, and the role that they play in our society, in our industry, and in giving people choices about how they get around, whether that's for work, for personal journeys, or for pleasure. It is critically important that we continue to have policies which ensure that New Zealand can have affordable, available access to motor vehicles in our country, and we have an industry to be able to serve that. So we're here to support you. We also want to make sure we've got the infrastructure for the future, whether that's roads, whether that's public transport, so that we can give people choices about how they get around our country, and importantly for freight to be able to move in and out of our country as well as we grow our country. So the National Party has released a Transport for the Future plan, how we intend to shape that. If we win this election, we look forward to having your support, and I look forward to engaging with you tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Simeon, for that speech of national significance. Let's move on to Helen. Now, Helen, you're not the Labour Party's transport spokesperson, but you're the acting spokesperson this evening. Your time starts now.
I can turn on the mic. Hello. First of all, thank you for the person who gave me their glasses so I can read my notes. But I'm not going to talk about my notes. I'm going to talk about my personal experience in this area. I was an employment lawyer in Auckland till quite recently, and I came in the last election. And I remember sitting in gridlock trying to go to the airport, and I had to go hours before I should have had to, because I couldn't actually guarantee I would get to my flight to Timaru. And I realised just how much we are losing in terms of productivity because our infrastructure is rubbish and it needs to be improved. And that is something that involves improving our roads, making sure we have rail, and making sure that we have things like coastal shipping. We need to take a really holistic view of those things and make sure it all works. We have been woeful in terms of our spend on infrastructure. We've got a climate crisis, and we have to take different kinds of actions, and I know that you want to be part of that.
Thank you very much for that, Helen. Just while we've got you there, and while you got your mic there, where is David Parker tonight?
I actually don't know where he is, but I'm sure he's very busy. I am on finance and expenditure and on transport and infrastructure and Regs Review, and I've been on that committee the whole time, so I'm perfectly happy to answer your questions.
Awesome. So there you go. You're pre-warned. Get your questions to the government. Let's move on to Julianne Genter from the Green Party.
Tēnā koutou katoa. I am just going to be really honest with you. If there are politicians who are saying that any issue other than climate change is the most important one for this election, they are wrong. Right now, a huge swathe of Canada is on fire. We've had a massive heat dome in North America. The ocean, the North Atlantic, is at unprecedented temperatures. This is because of human-caused climate change, and every living being on this planet is at threat if humans don't get their act together and change how we do things. Now, the good news is there are huge opportunities to do things better. We can actually be better off with a transport system that is less reliant on private vehicles, that gives people more choice, that's more energy efficient, that's electrified. It will clean up the air, have healthier, happier communities. It will cost us less money. But the only party standing in this election with realistic plans and policies that are going to address climate change and the inequality that we have in this country is the Green Party. Think about that when you vote.
Thank you for that, Julianne. The ACT Party, Simon Court.
Thank you very much. Firstly, I have to declare a conflict of interest. My son, Oscar, works in a full-service automotive garage in New Lynn. He spends most of his time taking modified Japanese cars around the block and trying to sneak in the odd burnout without his boss noticing. I'm desperately encouraging him actually to turn it into an apprenticeship. So if anyone could help me convince a 20-year-old bloke from West Auckland actually to start getting some qualifications and getting on with his life, I'd really appreciate your help and your consult afterwards. But I also want to offer some concession to Julianne, because she is passionate about climate change. What I heard when I sat on Transport Committee is that the problem of transport emissions will be solved not too far down the road, because just about every vehicle rolling off the assembly line in Asia or Europe between 2025 and 2028 will be an EV or a low emissions vehicle. So a lot of these problems technology is going to solve. But what's ACT's vision? Less red tape. Let's get rid of the clean car discount, the clean car standard. Let's allow Kiwis to choose what vehicle they drive, and let's stop the bullying of people because they choose to drive a car instead of catch a bus or ride a bike. There's a start.
Thank you very much for all of you, actually, for sticking to time. That's usually unheard of. Usually can't shut you guys up. So thank you very much. Just a bit of a roadmap how tonight's going to work. We've got 4 areas that we're going to focus on. We've got people, we've got safety, we've got the future fleet, and strong, fair markets. So that's how we're going to break up tonight into 4 of those chunks. Before we get into the first chunk, which is people, I've got a few quick-fire questions that I'd like to ask our politicians here, if that's all right. So we'll start with you, actually, Simon. What sort of car do you drive?
I drive a Subaru Outback 2020, and any chance I get, I put it in mud mode and get it off-road. But unfortunately, because this government's put the house into urgency just about every other week, that's not often.
Did you consider getting an EV?
No.
Okay. Julianne, I've seen your car park at Parliament, and there's not a car in it, but what kind of car do you drive?
Well, usually I use a Reeser and Muller Load 75 cargo bike, which is electric assist. It's amazing. It can carry children. I've carried adults up to 80 kg in it. I can carry all the shopping. The kids are under a rain cover. Costs next to nothing to run, plus it's a lot more fun. Don't get stuck in traffic. Don't have any trouble parking. But we do have a Honda Jazz. I think it's 2015. It's a manual transmission, and we inherited it from some friends who are moving to Germany. But we're hoping to sell it soon because Mevo, the car share, which has fully electric cars, has come into the zone where we live. And so previously we found it too hard to use the car share because we have 2 car seats. So we were sharing the Honda Jazz with another couple who have kids the same age as us, who are our neighbors, who also use cargo bikes for most of their trips.
Nice. Helen?
I have an electric scooter, which I've been using for about 8 years, and I used to use when I was going into the city in Auckland, and it was way the best way of getting around because of all the road cones. I also have a Volkswagen EOS. Yeah.
Is that electric car, is it?
No,
EOS?
it isn't.
No?
It was seen as one of the ones that was actually energy efficient at the time, but then there was a big scandal with Volkswagen. Where they'd actually been cooking the books. I thought about getting an electric vehicle, but I just don't do any Ks. I wouldn't, at the moment, I just don't do any. I barely use it. In fact, I think I may have done my car some damage by the little I use it.
Wonderful. Simeon?
I drive a Holden Equinox. I think it's 2 litre, and it's very nice to drive.
A big family wagon.
Well, I've got a big family, 3 kids.
Lovely. All right, let's move on to the first one, which is people, because people is what makes this industry go around, right? The people who maintain the whole country's fleet. Our first one is referring to the electric vehicles. There's no standards at the moment for who can actually do the work on an EV. Anyone can do it. You don't have to have a certificate. So we'll start down the other end, Simeon. How do you ensure that we've got the skills for people to actually service EVs in the future?
Well, I think the key thing here is you've got to be focused on having an industry-led approach to the standards and to the training, and that's what is certainly got to be the focus around any reforms when it comes to vocational education, is having it as industry-led as possible. And so, yes, we need to have a standard, but ultimately the standards will be set by the industry. And then they should be responsible for making sure the training is in place. I mean, at the moment you've got a very complicated situation with Te Pukenga, who's taking a very interesting role, centralised role around training around the country in terms of industry training and apprenticeships and everything else, when actually it should be as industry-led and as industry-focused as possible, so that the industry is managing that and making sure that the skills are there for the industry that it needs.
I mean, you guys are the industry, so if you've got any questions, any supplementaries, then fire them through. Julianne, we'll come to you on this one.
Ultimately, to make this transition, we are going to need to organize ourselves at the political level to give the support to people that they need. It's, combating the climate crisis is not something that individuals can do on their own or that individual industries can do on their own. So that's why the political level is so important. It is important that we're engaging with the industry, but we have to ensure that the support is there for people to retrain and that we have support for the standards so that we have the skills that are needed to service the fleet that we will need. And I think it's just something it's why we need well-funded, competent, and capable government to support industry and people within the transition. And I think parties that ideologically are opposed to government being involved are not capable. They will not create the conditions that will assist industry or individuals in this transition.
Simon, how do we future-proof our skills base?
Well, the Te Pukenga merger has been a disaster. Most people who get into an industry like automotive aren't coming out of university or tech if they're actually servicing vehicles. They want to get their hands dirty, or if they want to get into electric vehicles, they want to keep them clean but work on some really fun, high-powered, quick machines. The industry has to play its part. They should suggest a standard that we can simply adopt, whether it's from Europe or the US or Japan, for example. And then the role of government is to help the industry identify the micro-credentials that people working on vehicles now can use to actually take that next step so they are competent and capable of working on EVs. It's actually that simple.
Your thoughts, Helen?
Well, obviously, you know about Apprenticeship Boost, which has made a huge difference, and it's that pipeline of apprentices that's vital and actually disappeared in the GFC, and so we've been playing catch-up. I think we had 60,000 go through Apprenticeship Boost, and we've had a budget allowance for another 30,000. So that's a good start. It's an interesting issue about how you transition people from one type of business to another, like the electric work is probably quite different, and obviously that needs the consultation of the industry. But what I know that I'm committed to is that kind of just transition approach, where you bring people who are suitable across, and it's incredibly important. If we're going to move the whole way that we are in this country to a climate-friendly one, we have to bring people with us. And I think we can see that as a really core Labour principle, that you don't end up with people on really low wages or left behind.
You mentioned the apprenticeship boost there, and that's not actually a permanent measure. It's a temporary measure at the moment. Are you going to make it permanent?
Well, we've put in 30,000 and we've got our manifesto coming out, but I think it's been a roaring success.
It has been, but are you going to make it permanent, or you can't?
I can't talk about what's in the manifesto, but I can say that I think it has been a roaring success, and we put 30,000 more apprentices into the budget this year.
Simeon, if the National Party leads the next government, would you Would you entrench that, make it a permanent fixture, the apprenticeship boost?
Well, I can't speak to the. I can say we have supported that policy, and I think it's funded till the end of 2025, and we'll continue to support that. In terms of the future funding beyond that, I can't make that commitment due to I'm not the spokesperson for it, but I can certainly say it's certainly been something we've been very supportive of because it has made a difference. I mean, ultimately, there is a huge need to continue to encourage young people into apprenticeships and into the industry and help businesses with taking on young people, particularly for those first couple of years. So we have been very supportive of it.
Okay, we've talked about apprenticeship boost, and we do have the fees-free system for the first year of tertiary education. Should there be something separate though, so we can actually future-proof to ensure that our EVs and our low-emissions vehicles in the future actually have qualified people who know what they're doing? Should there be a specific fees-free program so people can train to do this properly? We'll start with you, Julian.
I do want to talk about our policy to have a guaranteed minimum income for everyone, because that, combined with our housing affordability policy, helps address the issues when people need to retrain. If we can make sure that everybody has enough, whether they're sick or whether they're in training or for whatever reason they're not working, we're all better off as a society. And that's why I have to say you can't just look at our transport policy in isolation. We have 7 policies. I think 6 of them have been announced, 6 out of 8, that are our priorities for the election. And one of the key ones is lifting people out of poverty and making sure that everyone has resources that they need. Because right now, students are having to live in poverty in order to get an education, and that is not how it should be. So if we can address housing affordability and we can guarantee people a minimum income, then when it comes time to have the retraining programs, we know people have that flexibility and that ability to find the job that they need. Because there's going to be an enormous amount of new jobs created by this transition to a zero carbon economy.
So was there an answer in that?
Yeah.
Would you support a fees-free program?
Our policy is actually to move towards totally fees-free tertiary education, but it's not enough to deal with the fees. You also have to deal with the cost of living when people are in our training. So.
Okay, we'll go to you now, Helen. It's a huge transition, right?
Yeah.
Who's going to pay for it? Should the government pay for it? Because someone's going to have to.
Yeah, it's a huge transition, and it's also associated with a whole lot of other industries that need to have the same kind of careful processes for people who are older who want to come in. So we've seen issues around things like midwives training and kind of the retraining of people who might come in when they've got little kids or they might be older. So it is something that needs a comprehensive solution to. I think it is something that we need to make sure that we're open to and change. And obviously I can't talk about manifesto commitments, but I think those older people retraining, it's something that absolutely needs to be dealt with.
Simon, we'll come to you now. You've said that it needs to be industry-led. Who's going to pay for it? Would that be industry?
Well, fortunately, the ACT Party has these principles, and we believe in user pays and market-based solutions. So if there's going to be a massive surge in the number of low-emissions vehicles coming to New Zealand, because that's all Toyota and Nissan and Kia and all of the other manufacturers have said they're going to supply us, then quite clearly the way that these vehicles are serviced and maintained is going to change compared to what we're doing now. But those customers will still have a 12-month warranty or a 24-month requirement to go and get their vehicle checked over. They'll still need steering, brakes, tyres, all of these other things serviced or checked at a regular interval as part of a warrant check. So what ACT would say is, look, what's important is to make sure that the technicians in the industry understand what the risks are and know how to repair vehicles or check them over. And of course, if people are bringing their vehicle back for a regular service, then they should be the ones paying for that.
I mean, not all of us are rich ACT Party voters, and we can't afford to buy cars and get them, serviced by the place that we buy them. So if you've got an EV that's 10 years old and you're going to go get it serviced, then we're going to have a lot of these second-hand EVs that are coming in. How are we going to train the people who are servicing them?
Well, it's quite likely if you've got a 10-year-old EV, it's almost ready for scrap. And so it's not just a matter of servicing them, it's what is going to happen with all of these vehicles at the end of their lives, because there are batteries and all kinds of other components which need to be deconstructed so that they can either be shredded or recovered or packaged up into shipping containers and sent for recovery in other countries. So it's not just a matter of who's going to pay to service the vehicles, it's also about, well, what kind of regime are we going to establish so that at the end of these vehicles' lives, we're not sending them to Sims, Metals and Onehunga, for example, to get put through a shredder. We're actually dealing with them in a way that is safe and environmentally friendly. Phoenix Metalman in Auckland are already pioneering how to do it. One of the things they told me was, though, that MB and some of the other regulators haven't actually established the right safety protocols or regulations even around how to handle end-of-life EVs. So there's a whole lot government could be doing to actually mark out the playing field before we get into, well, who should pay for these things. ACT believes it's quite simple. The users should pay their fair share.
10 years, is that what you give an EV? What about putting a new battery in it?
Well, I hear about people who bought a Nissan Leaf and the thing's broken down a couple of times on Transmission Gully. Now, that's why I would still choose to buy a petrol or a diesel vehicle, because the way I feel, my needs, I've got 3 kids as well, is that I need a reliable vehicle. Now, I am concerned about the price of fuel. I got dragged off by a Tesla trying to get on the motorway the other day, so I might reconsider an EV in the future. But look, these are all things that are going to come and we'll have to deal with in future. A lot of it we can't predict how this is going to land, but what we do know is by about 2030, most of the new vehicles coming to New Zealand will be low emissions EVs or hybrids, and by that time I will have expected that we will have found some way to adapt to it. But if you're asking governments to design regulation for 2030 now, well, you're going to get a whole lot of other things happening that might go wrong. They just might not get it right. It might cost a lot more. Let's wait and see how these things evolve.
Cool. Julian and Helen, I can see you guys biting your tongue on that. So am I. We'll just quickly go to Simeon on this one as well. Simeon, you love roads. Or your party does anyway. What's your solution to future-proofing our workforce for EVs and low-emission vehicles?
Well, I do love roads. And I guess the key thing in terms of future-proofing the workforce is industry has a critical role to play. There are people in this room already who are building workforces who can service and maintain electric vehicles. That is already happening. We need to make sure that the training criteria and the skill criteria are very clearly defined, but ultimately it needs to be industry-led, because we don't manufacture these things in New Zealand, they're manufactured around the world. We also, we do need to take a pragmatic approach in terms of the skills that we need in this industry. I mean, we have workforce shortages which need to be filled, and we have to take a pragmatic approach as well in terms of if there are shortages, then there are specialised skills that we need to bring into New Zealand. We need to have immigration policy which allows those people to come to the country so that we can make sure the industry is able to grow and have those skills and expertise here so that the industry can learn from those people and continue to expand.
Thank you, and we'll get to immigration and your thoughts on that and the workforce needs. Julianne, we'll start with you, just responding to either of those, because you're biting your tongue, and you've probably got something to say to the fuel guzzler.
No, I mean, I think I've already addressed this question because I started, but I guess it just comes down to that basic ideological difference where for years nothing has been done, no direction has been set by government, and that's why we're in this difficult situation we're in now. And so while government is not it's definitely not perfect, and I think we have a long way to go to make it work well with the public and with industry. Ultimately, it is at that public sector level that leadership needs to come from, and we need to set the direction of where we need to go and then work with industry. It's kind of like the wartime effort that we had in World War II to mobilize people. That was a massive politically directed decision that worked with industry to be able to tackle a threat. And it's similar to the space program in the 70s, where, in the 60s when they decided to go to the moon. I mean, ultimately, the 1980s and 90s were all about an ideology of government does nothing, and that's resulted in significant inequality where a lot of people are on low wages and living in difficult circumstances, and then that is now used as an excuse not to implement the policies that we need to transition, when we have every ability to lift people out of poverty, to give them the resources they need, and to work on this transition together. And you're not going to get that from the National and Ag Party.
There. We're getting a bit space racy there. You talked about the government not doing enough, but the Greens are at the government's table, and you were...
No.
They are.
No.
I mean,
Not really, no.
Well, no, I mean, you are. You've got ministers.
I mean, the climate minister is not in
minister.
cabinet. The climate minister is not in cabinet, and we have no leverage over Labour, and we've been very critical, and we have differentiated significantly from them. I would say
What about the previous
the
government
government would have been a lot better if the Greens had been in coalition with Labour. If Labour hadn't gotten a majority, we would be in a much better position. And the competence and the capability that people want from government is going to come from the Greens, because all of our Green ministers delivered, both last term and this term. We didn't have any stupid scandals. We didn't come up with, crazy bike bridge proposals. That was not my proposal. The Greens actually have competent ministers, and we need a lot more Greens in government in order to tackle this issue. National and ACT are not going to do anything about climate change. Their funders are going to put them in position so they can give tax cuts to the wealthiest people and cut back on government, which is going to result in worse public services and infrastructure. I guarantee it.
Let's come to you, Helen, because you're in government. Well, you're in a party that is in government. You've got a majority. You've got lots of power. You haven't been transformational. Why not?
I think we have been transformational. And no, I'm going to have my say, miss. Now, listen, one of the things I'd like to do is just respond to what I said, what was said there. Because James Shaw has been an incredibly effective minister, and he's been part of this government. I see him as part of this government, and I see actually the contribution that Julianne's made herself as being valuable. So I am not of the same opinion in terms of what that alliance has been like. It's been helpful. I think one of the things that happens when you're in a mainstream party is you're constantly making the hard calls. And sometimes you have to make choices between things. And we've had an incredibly challenging time to work in. But it doesn't mean that those things haven't been transformational. And I know from the document that I've got that one of the things that you are challenging us on in this document is the clean car discount. And I remember when I first came in and this was proposed, and I had some of the similar concerns about the fact that we were giving a discount to people who could afford $80,000 for a car. But I was quickly won over by the science of it, that this made a huge difference in terms of the turnover of the vehicles into the second-hand market. And it's been a huge success in terms of the change. And it's not on its own. Like, you might not agree with me on that, but you'll find that there is a comprehensive policy about bringing in electric vehicles and making sure that there's a hydrogen alternative being actually encouraged as well, so that we're bringing these things in to our structures, none of which would have happened if we'd had the national government at that time. And I remember...
Well, you didn't even campaign on it. You just put a new tax in. You can never trust Labour on tax.
Simeon and I remember talking about that clean car discount, and there was so much kind of baiting going on with things like ute tax, cultural wars going on, when in fact what we had was a tax of vehicles that were high emitting and were new vehicles. So somebody who could afford an $80,000 vehicle was being taxed for their emissions. Now, unless we're prepared to talk about those things and to act upon them, and we're prepared to do that across the board, we're in trouble.
Okay, that is the only transformational policy Labour's done.
Because I'm on a limited time.
It was one that the Greens did all the work on.
I could pick a dozen.
And wouldn't have happened if the Greens hadn't been in government last term. But I do want to add one thing.
When you were in government.
Because of Winston Peters, yeah.
Oh.
But luckily,
and then
I
Labour,
did all the work on it, and then they did bring it in. So good on them, because...
And you're accusing us all of ill motive, and it's just not true. Everybody in this group.
I think there's a really important point.
Put the spade to one side. Julianne, you can respond.
Oh, just on the clean car discount and why is so important is that it's shifted the vehicles being imported into the country significantly to be lower emissions. It's given people the opportunity to buy lower and use lower emissions vehicles. For example, the car share company Mevo acquired a lot of EV vehicles, and so you don't have to own an EV to benefit and be a member of that and pay to just use it once in a while. So lower income people can access car share, and we need a whole lot more of that. But the other aspect to it that I wanted to raise was that despite National and ACT fear-mongering about the policy, the latest polling shows that more than 50% of National Party identified voters support the fee on polluting vehicles. It is a fair policy. People know it's fair. Even Nationals voters support the policy. A majority of New Zealanders support it.
Thank you very much, Julianne. Just a quick show of hands. Who in the room has bought an EV and claimed the clean car discount?
Chris Luxon has.
He's done it twice, I think. Okay, so we've got, what, a handful? What about like a low emission car, not a full EV, but like a hybrid EV? Anyone? Okay, so we've got a few people. And do you want it gone? Do you want to keep it? Show of hands, people who want to keep it. Maybe we'll do it the other way around. Show of hands, people want to get rid of it. Okay, all right, fair enough.
No, that's the answer is to the clean car discount, not because you've owned one, right?
Yeah, that was to the clean car discount.
Yeah, so there were more people put up their hand to get rid of it than put up hands to owning it.
Yes.
So what you've got is a preconception that there's a problem with the
thank you, Helen.
Thank you, Helen.
This evening. Thank you very much for that. Let's talk about immigration, because all of these issues we can keep going on about forever, and I understand that, but we've got to stick to some time so you guys can get back to the halls of power. Immigration, should there be should those who are working on EVs, should they be on the green list? Mechanics with specialist EV skills, should they be on the green list so they can come into the country? We'll start with you, Simon.
Every employer who wants to employ someone, if they can't find someone here in New Zealand, they should be able to offer that job to an immigrant. Let's be clear, New Zealand is going to grow by millions and millions of people between now and 2050. Auckland Council's own plan, well, I do live in West Auckland, so that's the one I'm familiar with, suggests that Auckland will grow by between 500,000 people between now and 2050. That's just 27 years. We're going to have to bring a whole lot more people in to build the infrastructure, service our cars, all of these things. ACT says it shouldn't be up to a political decision by a minister. It shouldn't be up to some flaky people in Immigration New Zealand shuffling paper around to decide who comes in. We probably don't even need a green list. What we do need is businesses that are prepared to back employees so that those people are confident to come to New Zealand, because we're in a war for talent. With Canada, Australia, they've announced a big Australia policy. They want to double their population. They want 40 million people living between Adelaide and Brisbane. New Zealand is in a war for talent. We need to stop thinking about who we should say yes or no to and just say, crikey, if we want New Zealand to grow, if we want to be a modern, productive society, multi-ethnic, liberal democracy, let everybody who can work here come here.
Right, next we'll go to Winston Peters. Oh, we all know what his answer is going to be. Simeon.
Well, we've been very clear that the National Party, and as I said earlier, where there is a need for skills, we should be open to bringing those skills into our country. And I know that's a particular concern for people running businesses in this room. The Green List is being operated as in a far more political way than in a way that should be driven by what the need is in the industry. The other issue, and so we would make some significant changes to have it driven by data, not driven by whether the minister puts a particular job skill on the green list and who can lobby the loudest to get on there, which is the way. And you think about the bus shortage and the ferry worker shortage we've had in Auckland and Wellington, a lot of that's driven because the Minister of Transport and the Minister of Immigration couldn't talk to each other to sort out the list fast enough, even though they were the same person. And so, let's just get real, and let's driven by what's actually the needs rather than by what the political will of the appetite is. The other thing is you've got to get processing times sped up rapidly. Average of 76 days or something, up from 38 to get a visa approved. It's far too long. Got to sort that out too.
Helen, your party created the Green List, but EV mechanics are not on it.
Yeah, and it's constantly being reviewed. So it's not a no.
Politically.
No, actually, it's not about politics, it's about economics. So there are a couple of things here. If you're in Auckland, there's a housing crisis because we just simply don't have enough houses for the people, mainly that we've brought in. And so we had an issue there where actually the taxpayers are going to foot the bill for the people that we brought in. So we can't be indiscriminate about who we bring in. And we also have to think about wages. Now, I just want to address the bus drivers. I know it's slightly out of your ambit, but I went and I was the lawyer for the bus drivers for quite a long time. And the wages were about $17 an hour when I was doing that job. And they had split shifts where they were off work in the middle of the day, way away from their homes. They weren't earning enough to make ends meet. And they couldn't even afford to walk out of the depot in the middle of the day and eat something. It was a pretty sad life. Nobody wanted to be a bus driver anymore because the wages were crap. Now, if you think that the answer to that, Simeon, is bringing in a whole lot of Indonesian bus drivers, I'm sad.
Well, you got them from Fiji instead.
I don't want that. I don't want low-paid economies anymore. I want a sustainable economy where we have enough houses to house people, where we have decent wages in this country. And
Okay,
so it is a balancing act.
Come back to the question. Should they be on the green list?
Yes, if there is a demonstrable need.
Okay, thank you very much. Julianne.
Yes, also we need e-bike mechanics, and we need to support training for those, because there's actually many more electric bikes being sold than cars at this point, so we do need more specialized mechanics for those. But my colleague Ricardo Menendez March has done a lot of campaigning on immigration reform. I think the difference between the Green Party's approach and National and ACT is we don't see human beings as economic units to be brought in simply to service the rest of the economy. So we do take a progressive approach. It is important to allow people to come in to ensure we're getting skills we need, but let's treat them like human beings and ensure that they have the freedom to be able to leave an abusive employer, to be reunited with their family, and make sure that we have the other employment relations rules in place to ensure that we're not driving down wages and conditions and using immigration as a way to do that.
Aren't we all just slaves to the machine, though? You know?
No.
Okay.
No, you're a human being.
Thank
Lloyd,
you. Very kind.
I see you.
Very kind. Oh, bless you. Let's do some quick fires here to spice things up. Bilingual road signs, Te Reo Māori and English. Simeon, we'll start with you. Are you a fan or not?
Well, why don't we fix the potholes first?
Okay, so we've fixed the
either
potholes
or.
and we've got some signs that need replacing because the reflectors aren't working and people have shot them up with bullet holes and whatnot. Should we replace them with Te Reo Māori signs? Bilingual signs?
Look, we've said we're not opposed to bilingual signs, but the focus around what NZTA should be doing at the moment is fixing our roads. That's their priority.
It's an organization with over 2,000 employees and a whole lot of different things that it needs to do.
1,000 more than when National left office, and it's got 3 times as
I
many
agree, it's way too
communications
big,
officers, it's got twice as many HR managers, it's got 500 people with the title manager. That's probably half the problem in New Zealand, is we need to get NZTA focused back on its core business of building and maintaining our roads.
You've got to have people, though, to be able to do that. So you'll cull the staff and then go, oh, heck.
It's about making sure that the organisation and it's across our public service is focused on its core business.
Okay, we'll take that hat off because you're also the public service spokesperson. What about you, Helen, on that question?
Yeah, I'm for the signs, but also I just want to comment on that issue, which is the constant bark, as there's too many people. Again, from my experience as an employment lawyer, I represented people when there were issues at the Ministry of Transport and the various organisations where we weren't doing the checks that we should have been doing. And people died, right? That was because we didn't have enough people doing that work and they weren't taking it seriously. So be careful what you wish for, mate.
Simon, we'll come to you.
So ACT is only interested that motorists get the right information to make the right decision as they pass a sign. Whether it's Te Reo Māori, English, doesn't really matter. But we do need to be mindful that if the signs are going to be twice the size in order to incorporate both languages, that means that the architecture, the base, all of those things need to be twice the size or twice the depth. There is a cost to doing these things. So if we are going to adopt bilingual signs, then we need to make sure we've accounted for that. But I also just want to reflect on the role that Waka Kotahi NZTA has when it comes to safety. Only 800 of the more than 2,000 staff are actually involved in operations. In the past, we had the Land Transport Safety Authority, and what ACT says is, look, we'd be better off separating those functions, having a safety regulator that focuses on efficiency and safety, and Waka Kotahi focused on operations, actually delivering roads. And of course, safety needs to include potholes, because anyone who's swerving to avoid a pothole going into the other lane is also putting themselves and other motorists at risk. So it's not just about bilingual signs, it's about what on earth is the GPS for land transport, what is central government's policy for transport? If it's not around safety and efficiency, then it's not working.
That was meant to be quick fire, but we'll come to you, Julianne Genter.
Okay, yes. And I don't think the signs need to be twice as big. I don't think that's a fact. So, and I just want to be honest that like people raising this issue are buying into and playing into a really ugly movement that is looking to raise up fear and anger, primarily amongst people who are maybe Pākehā and older, about things they don't understand. It's ugly, and it should not be encouraged, and no party in the New Zealand Parliament should be engaging in this sort of bullshit.
Thank you very much for that. Swear word. Have we got any questions from the floor? Anyone got any questions? Put your hand up. Great. I'll grab a mic and we'll come over to you. Let's borrow your mic. Sure. Thank you very much.
I'd like each of the politicians to answer the question is what their plan B is if we find ourselves in a situation where EVs aren't in a position to be shipped to New Zealand because we're at the other end of the world, we're a small island, when you've got the major marine shipping companies having a review of whether they're going to allow the shipping of EVs, meant to be happening in Q1 of 2024, but may be brought back into Q4 of 2023 due to the two disasters that we're all fully aware of with the Harmony Ace and the Fremantle Highway. Alliance Marine Insurance has identified 13% increase in vessel fires in the last 5 years, and the only change really has been that they're shipping EVs over and above normal internal combustion engine cars. It'd be interesting to know what your plan Bs are if we find ourselves without EVs.
Great, there we go. Simeon, we'll start with you. What is plan B? Sorry for nudging you there. Chairperson, President, what's your plan B?
That's a good question. I mean, the reality is the technology is going to continue to advance, and this is an issue that is going to have to be addressed in terms of the manufacture of batteries and their fire risk. But that is going to continue to change and evolve over time as the manufacturers have to work out how to de-risk, the battery fire risk in those batteries. So ultimately, it's the government can't stand here and say, we're going to solve that problem, build a bridge across the, build a bridge to Australia or something. I don't know. But ultimately, the technology will shift as that develops. There's also hydrogen vehicles as well, which will continue to come in, and that technology will continue to change and evolve as well.
A bridge of Australasian significance, one could call that. All right, Helen, sorry, terrible joke. Helen, we'll move on to you.
This is going to really shock you. I'm going to agree with Simeon. Yeah. It's something that is misunderstood about the clean car discount, is it's not about EVs. Like the top subsidy goes to EVs because they're the lowest emitter, but the subsidy continues right through a range, and there are cars that are petrol cars in that group because they are energy efficient. So the plan B is very likely to go to your next most energy efficient approach, and it probably means that things like hydrogen would have more take up than they currently do. And I agree that the technology is just going in leaps and bounds.
Julianne, it's the time for us to open a lithium mine in New Zealand and start building these EVs ourselves.
Well, I actually have often wondered whether it wouldn't make sense for us to try and support conversion here in New Zealand. The economics of it haven't been looked at, whether we could convert some of our existing fleet to electric. I know people have attempted it. Because there's large-scale manufacturing of EVs now, it's probably not going to happen, but I would definitely say EVs are not the answer. Like, 1 out of 3 car trips in this country are less than 2 kilometers. There's a huge opportunity for more walkable and cyclable cities and towns, for better public transport. We actually do still have one bus manufacturer who makes full EV buses down in Christchurch. I would love to see us support more manufacturing here in New Zealand so that we have more sovereignty. You know, one of the current global supply chain risks do pose an issue as climate change gets worse. And we saw what, with COVID, when China was shutting down, it affected the whole world. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to be so reliant on things from overseas. So it would be great if we could support more domestic industry here in New Zealand to support our transition.
Simon.
Oh, Actricans will be fine. I mean, despite the best efforts of Labor and the Greens, they haven't managed to shut every petrol station in New Zealand yet. So even if the international insurers say, hey, there's a problem with shipping certain types of vehicles, we've seen recalls on certain models or makes because they are more subject to some of these risks. I'm confident that the international manufacturing industry will sort it out and there will be some kind of transition in the future to lower emissions vehicles. But New Zealand can't solve a lot of these problems. We just need to focus on the things we can control, which is actually removing a lot of the sticky regulations and red tape, like the Clean Car Standard, which ties vehicle importers up in knots, adds cost, actually doesn't necessarily help us reduce emissions because we don't make cars here, as Julianne pointed out. We can only import vehicles that come from other countries that are miles ahead of us. So look, there's a whole lot of stuff we could do, but there's not much point in worrying about things we're not in control of.
Fair enough. Okay, let's move to our second road of the evening. We'll take a turn and we're going to talk about safety, and there's 2 elements to safety. I want to talk about vehicle safety to begin with, and particularly warrant of fitnesses, because at the moment 40% of vehicles fail their warrant of fitness at their first inspection. In some places it's 46%. That's a pretty significant failure rate. Do we need to start changing the warrant of fitness regime, updating it, bring it into the 21st century? Simeon, we'll start with you. Do you want to keep it as it is?
Look, I think there's a couple of things, 3 things I think that need to be looked at. Firstly, the issue that all vehicles from 2000 onwards only can have a 12-month warrant of fitness, and that hasn't changed. I think that probably does need to be moved to actually move with time so that it doesn't continue. And older vehicles, we know older vehicles are more likely to fail, so that needs to be updated. I think the second thing is looking at the issue around warrant of fitnesses, and I think it is probably time to have a bit of a review of the actual tests. And thirdly, the penalty, it's only $200. I think the penalty is if you haven't got a warrant of fitness, and it is quite a major safety concern, and I know the government has been doing a review around the whole penalty regime, and it is something which I'm not sure where that piece of work is at. I think it's got stuck, but that is something which will need to be reviewed as well.
Are you actually lobbying on increasing fines?
Well, the $200 fine hasn't been changed for a long time, and there is a number of fines in the whole safety space which haven't been changed for some time. And the reality is we do need to, fines are one of the tools to help create behaviour change. So it is something that if you compare our fines with Australia's, in many cases we're a long way behind. So yeah, it's not exactly the issue that everyone's going to be excited about, but you've also got to make sure you've got appropriate deterrence in place.
I guess you've got to find a way to pay for your tax cuts somehow, right? We'll move on to you, Helen.
Yeah, I was interested in this part of the report that you guys have on your chairs, because it talks not only about the warrant of fitnesses, but also the emissions and the testing for emissions and whether that's adequate. I think it's something I'd like to, I don't know whether there are plans afoot on this at this point, but I think it's something that I'd like to take back. I think it's a really interesting thing that's coming up from the people who are dealing with it, that they're worried about that. The one about the engine light being on and still getting your warrant if the engine light's on is interesting.
Great, thank you for that. Julianne?
Yeah, I agree with all of the calls of the MTA when it comes to warrant of fitness changes and emissions testing. And I think I said at a dinner that you put on at Parliament in June, or an event, that we had to tackle emissions rules around the vehicles coming into the country first, and then it makes sense to start looking at emissions rules around the vehicles that are on the road, and that has to be the next step. And especially since we've heard about the harmful particulates and NOx emissions and the huge health cost that is having on our, I don't know, how many of you have heard about that? Yeah, I mean, they're talking about maybe 10 times as many deaths a year from NOx from vehicles as deaths on the roads, like 3,000. And huge numbers of childhood asthma cases can be linked to harmful emissions from vehicles on the road. And I don't think New Zealanders realise that, and I think the government has a duty to protect them and to work with the industry to clean up our fleet.
Simon, your face is doing some interesting things there.
Yeah, well, firstly, we've got to ask, why are vehicles turning up and failing WAFs? Is it tyres? Is it suspension, brakes? What is it? In many cases, people who are facing affordability issues in their life are having to make choices about whether they replace the 4 tyres or 2, whether they get a second-hand tyre just to pass a warrant. So it's not just that the warrant check needs looking into. We also need to recognise people are doing it really tough. And that's why ACT says, hey, there's some simple things we could do for workers. We have released a fully costed alternative budget. What we show is we can save $16 billion of wasteful spending, $8 billion a year for the next 2 years, by cutting out some of the 15,000 extra bureaucrats that Labor's hired since 2017, and we can return $2,300 in a tax cut, a permanent tax cut to people earning up to $78,000. What ACT would do is make sure people have more of their own money to spend on things they need to, like tyres and brakes, rather than working out whether the government should be hiking fines here, there and everywhere. But if you ask why it's screwing up my face, I mean, there's this thing with this apparently 3,000 people a year dying from emissions. Look, there's all kinds of epidemiological studies that have been rolled out in the past few years showing how many people would die of stuff. But I grew up in New Zealand in the 1980s when I first got a driver's licence. The air was blue through Spaghetti Junction in Auckland. Yeah, the emissions from vehicles, whether it was sulphur dioxides or lead and petrol, were horrendous. Our vehicle fleet is almost invisible in terms of its emissions now. We really need to be focusing on things that are helping people get ahead, like making sure they have enough money in their pocket if they do want to replace a vehicle, or actually put tyres on the car.
The harmful NOx emissions are invisible. You can't see them, but they're still causing harm.
Actually, you can. It's called smog, Julianne.
No, not nitrogen. No.
Transport planner,
Nitrogen
engineer.
dioxide.
I don't know how this is going to end.
Yeah, radiation, can't see it. Doesn't affect me. It's a pretty much. I just want to talk about one thing that you brought up, Helen, which was emissions testing, and the MTA's called for emissions testing for a long time. Is it time that we need to bring emissions testing in? We'll start with you, Simon, actually, just because you love regulations in the ACT Party. But why not do it when you're getting a warrant of fitness? Why not have an emissions test? It's a pretty simple thing that you can do.
Well, I understand the current test is if you can see visible emissions. And it wasn't that long ago. Like I said, when I got a driver's licence, pretty much every vehicle on the road, you could see visible emissions. It wasn't good. Look, the ACT Party believes that if there is a real public health issue that needs to be solved, well, fine. But I haven't seen the evidence, and I don't see why it's necessary to impose this cost on motorists. What we do know, though, if people can afford to replace their vehicles every 10 or 15 years or so, then the vehicle fleet will actually get younger and more efficient, and it will happen quite quickly. So we could test everything and regulate everything, or we could just make sure Kiwis have more money to spend on the things that they need, like maybe upgrading their car.
Helen, your thoughts on emissions testing, because you just read that in the pamphlet there.
Well, I sort of gave an answer, so if I can just kind of respond and deepen it. Obviously, one of the biggest advantages of the approach to bringing in clean cars was that we were cleaning up the fleet. We had the dirtiest fleet in the world, I think. We were basically the dumping ground for other vehicles, and we have to keep on moving with the times with regard to that. So that's a huge plus on emissions, but I think we probably are at that point where people are starting to understand the dangers of those kinds of emissions more than they ever did. I mean, we had a whole lot of legislation come through about cruise ships and making sure that they weren't they weren't using fuels and discharging in our harbour. And I was quite shocked at the amount of deaths involved in the release of those kinds of fuels.
I want to see the death certificate where someone died from cruise ship smoke. I want to see it.
Well, actually, there's some really good research on this. It's a very important thing to kind of pull this science up and have a look. So just Google, because that's what I did alongside what I was reading. I was luckily supplied by the library. It is quite a shocking story. Clean air isn't a joking matter, and I live in Auckland where there's a lot of valleys, and it's a serious issue. And asthma is a huge issue in New Zealand, and we probably all know people who've died of asthma. So, these are really big issues, Simon, and we can't afford to live in the 70s.
Simeon, I'd like your thoughts on this. You've got some young kids. You must be concerned about emissions. They're a lot closer to the ground. The exhaust fumes are there. And so are you.
That's right. I didn't hear your last comment.
I said, and so are you.
Yeah, that's right. Someone says, stand up, Simeon, stand up. But I've been trying to ever since I was born. But anyway, well, I think Simon does have a point. There is obviously, I think there is a real issue around emissions, but the question is then, how do you solve the problem? Do you come in and regulate and add cost onto people, or do you encourage policies which help to speed up the churn so that we have a much newer fleet over time? And I guess our view is, at this stage, to put in place a mandatory emissions testing as part of a warrant of fitness would increase the costs significantly. It's not something we're saying is a terrible idea. You certainly want to encourage people to be voluntarily doing it, I think. But over time, if we can have cleaner vehicles coming into the market and more of them, they will have lower emissions, they will have a lower impact on our environment, and those are the policies that we need to be pursuing.
Julian, if I come to you on this one, you kind of had a bit of a spar there, but...
Yeah, I mean, I started, I think, didn't I?
Yeah, I mean, you can finish it if you'd like.
I mean, New Zealand has one of the highest rates of childhood asthma in the world, and we know that there is a link here that Māori and Pacifica young people are more likely to suffer the harms of air pollution because of where the traffic is and where their homes are. So, I mean, there's a serious injustice here, and there is the ability for us to fix it. I mean, I lived in the state of California. We've had mandatory smog testing every 3 years since the 1990s, and it's had a noticeably and measurably positive impact on air quality and human health as a result of that. And if you're really concerned about costs on low-income people, then support a minimum income, support rises to the minimum wage, support more equitable tax system that taxes those at the top and supports those at the bottom. You can't honestly care about inequality if that's not your policy. And then you go out and use it as a reason to not act and protect our children and protect the people who live near high-traffic areas. There are cities in Europe that have banned diesel vehicles because of the harmful impacts on health. And the sooner we tackle this issue, the sooner we are going to gain the benefits for our kids.
Thank you very much. We've got a question from the floor. I'll just grab the communal mic. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello. It's interesting the comments about that we can't control what overseas manufacturers produce, and that's quite correct. But what we can control is what we implement in New Zealand. And you're referring to a NOx study, but there's actually been health reports around the impact of vehicles on people for a large number of years. And there's quite a few European studies which talk about if you live within 5 kilometres of a dense motorway, for example, you will have a lower health life than someone who doesn't. So what people who are in government can control in New Zealand, especially while we have a large landmass and a low volume of people, is where are we going to develop our transport infrastructure going forward? If we become a country of 15 or 20 million people, where are those houses going to be in relation to these transport modes? And if you take the bigger picture approach and say, unless we become the Jetsons, we are still going to have a means of travel, especially into city. So why don't we control where these roads are, regardless of what the vehicle fuel is, relative to where people live? And if we talk about Wellington, for an example, and we have this nice new motorway, Transmission Gully, and yet if you drive along Transmission Gully, you'll see that the Porirua City Council has currently allowed new housing developments. No houses have been built yet.
Can we get to the question?
New roads are being developed within 50 metres of Transmission Gully. Why on earth are we allowing developments around major roads of significance when we know there's such poor health outcomes within 5 kilometres?
Well, ultimately, that's a council decision, but one that we wouldn't agree with. But also, if we have an entirely roads-based... we can have many, many more homes. In fact, I would really love to bring up now Simeon's top 5 countries in the world for the best roads, because they are Singapore, Netherlands, Japan, Hong Kong, and Switzerland. And they're all countries that have higher density housing, more car-free areas in their cities, significant investment in public transport and intercity rail. In the Netherlands, using a bike is a major mode of transport, 1 of 4 trips in the urban areas. And all of that, they have cleaner air, they have lower transport costs, public and private. And we could do that here in New Zealand because we once had that. We once had cities that were connected by frequent buses and trains. We had cities that developed around electric tramways. And there's the opportunity to where we build our houses, how we build our cities, how we build our transport system absolutely impacts on pollution, on quality of life, on time spent traveling, on affordability. And there's a really smart way to do it. And that's why, I got involved in politics, because I could see New Zealand could do a lot better on building energy efficient houses that are warm and dry, and building transport systems that make sense. And if we focus on what the Green Party is proposing, we can achieve much better housing and transport affordability while reducing emissions and achieving better quality of life.
Great. There should be a tiny reminder to keep your answers relatively short, if that's right. Did you want all of the candidates to answer your question, or just Julianne? We've got another question at the back, the middle.
Yeah, hi there, Terry from the AA. We all want to have the potholes fixed. We all want to have more resilient roads. We want cycleways are a great idea, coastal shipping and trains. They all cost money. My question's probably more towards Simon and Simeon. You're talking about getting rid of the fuel excise duty, which is the hardest to evade and the cheapest to recover, and you want to move to a distance travel mechanism, RUC, which is the easiest to evade, the most expensive to implement and maintain. My challenges are, what are your thinking around that?
Well, the key thing here is, as we all move to cleaner vehicles, we're going to be using less fuel. And excise is based on how many litres of fuel that you use. So we still need to pay for the infrastructure that you've just spoken about, and we need a system which will allow us to be able to recover the cost from people who use the roads. And so our principle is based on user pays per kilometre that you travel. The RUC is a world-leading method of measuring based on distance and weight. It's been around for a very long time, and our view is it should be applied to all vehicles. Now, you raised some really good points around implementing that across petrol. You're correct. Excise is very cheap to collect. It's very hard to evade. But the reality is, over time, we're going to have to make that move. And so we're committed to doing that, committed to moving all vehicles to RUC. In terms of the time frame, we haven't committed to a time frame for that. Technology can certainly play a key role in helping to mitigate those risks that you have highlighted. But there's hundreds of thousands of light diesel vehicles on our roads right now. I think NZTA, through written questions I've asked around how much they believe is evaded, it's something like it is tens of millions a year that they estimate is not but it's still through technology. That's how we need to get that down. eRUC for trucks has done that for the heavy vehicles. We need to look at technology to do that for light vehicles as well.
Yeah, just really briefly, ACT released our policy of world-class tolling system a couple of weeks ago in Christchurch. It sets out a method to actually build more infrastructure for whatever the wheeled vehicle is, and to have it paid for through a revenue gathering scheme like tolling. And here in November last year, we released our solutions for building New Zealand and conserving nature, which includes a wholesale restructuring of the way roads are funded, financed and delivered. We propose to scrap Waka Kotahi altogether and to establish a state-owned enterprise, Highways New Zealand, with two measures, efficiency and safety, to separate out the safety functions to LTSA, a reconfigured LTSA. Now, when it comes to revenues, we're still going to need a residual fuel tax or some kind of residual fee charged to all road users to pay for the back office stuff, but what people pay to drive on the road should be hypothecated back to the road or the corridor that they're using.
Wonderful. And we do have one more question from the floor. I'll just do one more question from up here, and then we'll come down to you. Thank you very much. Let's talk about scrapping EVs, because they will get to a stage, maybe just 10 years, like you say, Simon. How do we recycle EVs? How do we scrap them? Do we know how? Should there be some kind of guidance from the government? And should there be incentives for people to do it, even if it's, I think there was a scheme that Labor had that they then got rid of, in which it's easy for people to scrap their cars. We'll start with Labor.
I think you're talking about the microphone. The one.
Yeah, use your microphone. Yep.
Yeah. I think that this area is rapidly developing, and it belongs to a whole group of changes which are about stewardship of all our things. I mean, it wasn't just cars, was it? We've all grown up at a time when we've got rid of the fridge every time it broke down. And it's completely insane. We just can't live like that anymore. So there's a whole lot of work going on around that, and there's been a number of different policies that have looked at that area. I've seen some pretty good operations which are using scrap metal from things, but I also just wanted to say that I don't agree that an EV lasts 10 years. One of the most amazing things about EVs is that you'll come across, and not just EVs, hybrid cars, is you'll come across taxi drivers who are travelling like a long way, and the vehicles aren't breaking down in the way that a combustion engine did for obvious reasons. And so it really does liberate people from the maintenance costs that they've been suffering. And that's really very important when you get to the second-hand market. So Simon might want to get rid of his EV after 10 years, but I'll be buying it.
And so when because we're talking about the future of our fleet here, we're going to get to a stage in which you do need to get rid of an EV or recycle it or scrap it. And I know it's a long way in the future, but these are things that we've got to think about, aren't they, Julianne?
Yeah, absolutely. And car batteries, EV car batteries, can get a whole another life afterwards, as supporting a home solar system, and that can help make battery storage more affordable. We've put out a plan called the Clean Power Payment, which is all about supporting mass uptake of rooftop solar alongside insulating homes and removing gas appliances and replacing them with electric, so grants and low interest loans available to people to do that. And if people have EVs, then that becomes their battery, but also once it's done in the car, it can actually be repurposed to a home battery for another period of time, and we don't yet know how long, but there's a whole industry waiting there to be developed and supported around repurposing batteries and making sure that we are getting them in a cycle of continuous use. There's so many opportunities. I can see someone with his head in his hands. He doesn't believe me. That's okay. You don't need to, sir. The science is out there, and there are huge opportunities to do more with less, and that's something we can do.
Simeon, what's your thoughts on what's your knowledge of? Oh, would you like a right of reply? Okay, I mean, yeah.
Ultimately, they become waste at some point in their life. Currently in Europe, they've not managed to recycle anything past around 95%. And that 95% is the
See, these are all good questions because we just don't know, right?
Maybe I can help. I worked as an environmental engineer in the waste industry for about 14 years, dealing with toxic sludges, green goo in barrels. And there is always going to be a waste treatment option for that kind of product, but it's going to be very, very expensive. But the problem we've got now is the government's wasted 3 or 4 years coming up with a clean car scrappage scheme. They're going to shell out $569 million to people, paying them 10 or 12 grand each to hand over some clunker that if you ring up the scrappy, they'll actually take it off your hands for $400. I mean, that's what this government thinks about your taxpayer money. And then we've got this issue of them subsidising this massive number of EVs to come to New Zealand, but without actually having provided a regulatory framework to deal with the waste that comes out the back end. Now, I did talk about a business in Auckland, Phoenix Middleman, which is dealing with these EVs, with the batteries, actually taking them out of end-of-life electric vehicles, taping up. They literally have to wrap duct tape around the terminals and then put them in a shipping container and send them back to Korea for recycling. They'd prefer to recycle them here, but of course then you'd need RMA consents and all kinds of things in order to do that. We make it very hard to deal with our own problems here. ACT says, look, actually, here's one prepared earlier. Here's an RMA reform as well. It's ACT Solutions to Building New Zealand and Conserving Nature. Shows how it would be much easier to get consents under a government that adopted ACT's policies. So we could actually get on with building recycling plants if that's what we needed to do.
Simeon, what are your thoughts on how we recycle these batteries or scrap them?
Well, ultimately, how they're recycled and managed is going to have to be led by the industry. I mean, it's a problem that is going to be grappled with by the industry, and in terms of whether that's done locally or whether that's exported, the industry is going to have to find those solutions. I think Simon's right, though. If there's regulation that we can take out of the way to make it easier to do that in New Zealand, then we should be doing that so that we can recycle as much as possible locally here in New Zealand. I guess the problem we've got is if you sort of think that the government needs to fix all of these problems and come up with, the precise way on how you've got to recycle a battery, well, you're going to be spending a very long time and you're not really going to go that far. So the government does have a role around regulation, but it doesn't ultimately be led by people in this room.
And product stewardship schemes are really important, and I applaud the MTA's call for product stewardship schemes in this area.
You've got 30 seconds, Helen. You're begging me for some time.
I just wanted to add, I do think government has a role in innovation in this area. And I've seen people do it privately, and there's been crowding in funding in those situations, and I've seen them do it with government funding. And sometimes the crowding in of government funding does actually make these things happen. So it is our job to help if it's got a public good. If you have a look at something called Mint, it's not about cars, but it's about batteries and cell phones. And they extract everything in the battery and recycle it. And it's quite an incredible story. And that's the kind of innovation that we get to see as politicians. We're bloody lucky to see it, and it makes you realise that these industries are just going in leaps and bounds.
Cool. Quick means short, just FYI. We've had a few questions come in because we're streaming it. And so there's been a few online questions, but we're just going to take a question from the front.
Thank you. Paul Melville from Federated Farmers. With all the issues facing farmers at present, it might be surprising that Federated Farmers members will often say the state of their rural roads is one of their number one concerns at the moment. The National Land Transport Fund used to be fairly focused on improving the state of our roading network. Now the fund has been used to invest in things like Kiwi Rail, Light Rail, $5 billion on public transport, another $1 billion on walking and cycling, and even things like coastal shipping. On the revenue side of the ledger, the government is topping up the fund through the NZ Upgrade Program, Provincial Growth Fund, and money to cover the fuel excise holiday. It's all a bit of a confusing mess that no longer represents any kind of user-pays system. So a question for you is, if you're in government after October, what will you do to ensure that someone in a rural community who's paying a road user charge or maybe a petrol excise duty can be once again confident that that money is going to be spent on improving the quality of their rural roads?
Let's start with you, Helen, given you are in government at the moment.
Yeah, so the But the amount of money that was spent on roads is actually misunderstood quite a bit. And we were at a debate recently, and we'd just been in front of the Minister for Transport, and we were asking questions, actually all of us, I think. And it was interesting to see the graph, because in the last national government, the roads of national significance took almost all the money, and very little was spent on maintenance. And so there has been a big increase in the spend on maintenance by Labour, but there's also been a commitment to a way bigger increase in the spend on maintenance, because there's huge amounts of work to do, because there was an issue with that. So I open by talking about how coastal shipping's important and rail's important. All these things are important, but so are the states of the roads. And obviously when you've got issues like flooding, then you need your roads to function, and it's expensive to fix them. We've committed the money to doing so.
Simon, if you're the ACT Party's propping up the next government, what's your promise you're going to make?
Well, the ACT Party's here to do the hard stuff, so we're quite happy to take on the issue of road funding and pricing. I worked as a maintenance contract engineer for 4 years, so I'm familiar with the problems that our feds are concerned about. But here's the thing, this government is going to borrow $900 million to throw at maintenance over the next 3 years, according to their GPS land transport. Who on earth borrows for OPEX? That's how lost they are. What ACT would say, actually, we do need to maintain the current level of spend on roads, but a whole lot of other projects that have qualified for funding out of the National Land Transport Fund, they actually need to make their own business case, go back to a different minister, whichever that is, and make a case where they should continue to be funded. Because until we can sort out the basic issues like whether roads are available for the productive sector, New Zealand's productivity is going to fall behind. Our economic performance is not going to achieve what we could, and that's why ACT says we actually need to spend more money on roads. And what we propose in our tolling proposal is actually to also toll major highways that get a pounding for maintenance. And Labor's just agreed that they'd do that with Penlink in Auckland. It's possible, but we can't fix the $1 billion deficit in road maintenance with the pennies we've got now. We're going to have to go hunting the pounds.
Julianne.
You'll be probably surprised to hear this, but I've been the biggest champion for rural roads in Parliament since 2011 when I was elected, because at that time, Stephen Joyce and then Jerry Brownlee and the National Party had frozen maintenance funding, and not only that, they reduced the funding available to local roads. So one of the biggest misconceptions is the belief that petrol tax and road user charges cover all the roads. They don't. 50% of all of the driving is done on local roads, and local roads are only half funded from that. They're part funded by rates, and a lot of our rural roads are actually reliant on rates. So when the Roads of National Significance program came up, the reason they called it that was because the highways they wanted to fund didn't have a high enough benefit to cost ratio to get over the line under Transit's previous policies. So, projects like, and they're basically urban highways, they're urban fringe highways. They were all in Auckland, Tauranga, Hamilton, a bypass of Hamilton again, the road north of Wellington. Let's face it, that's all about either suburban sprawl or Wellingtonians going on highways, on holiday.
Or resilience.
It's not about, our actual economic products, which are moving on rural roads in Southland, in Northland, in the rural Waikato, on the East Coast. So when we first got in 2018, I tried to reallocate funding to local roads, so there'd be more money for local roads. And also, we put way more money into road maintenance. But there's two problems. One is they were underinvested in for a long time. And the second one is climate change is making storms and flooding worse, and that's affecting, the emergency works that need to be done. There's more slips, and it's affecting the surface of the road. So, I understand where you're coming from, and I do think that we need that wakakotahi and road funding needs to be reallocated, because right now, where you're driving, the people paying the money to use the road are not necessarily getting the roads they use every day improved. And that's why over-focus on mega projects isn't the solution. But walking, cycling, public transport in the cities is way more cost-effective than an urban motorway. And why, both National and Labour want to spend $33 to $45 billion on roads in central Auckland and Wellington. Like, that's not going to help you. But the Green Party actually wants a rational approach to transport funding,
Right.
and walking, cycling, light rail is part of it, but part of it is putting more money into
Julianne,
the roads
the
where
bell
people
has gone
don't have an
twice.
alternative.
Thank you very much.
The farmers will be enjoying taking their cows on the light rail.
They don't need to. You want to spend $40 billion on roads in Auckland where light rail would work.
I don't want to spend $60 billion on light rail.
Okay,
but I'll answer.
No, on
if
highways.
If I could answer the question,
Yes, thank
I
you,
think
Simeon. What promises can you
I
make?
think the
Because this is all going on YouTube.
Yeah, thank you.
You're the Transport Minister in 3 months' time. What promises can you make about
Well, the
this?
question was around the National Land Transport Fund and the use of those funds. Of course, we all pay into it through road user charges and petrol excise. And the critique from Federated Farmers was that the funds are being used for a range of other non-roading projects. And there's an additional activity class added about interregional passenger rail. This one, there's coastal shipping, rail, there's huge amounts, billions going into light rail and other things out of that fund.
No, that's not true. It's
Well,
not from the National Land Transport Fund. There's no money allocated.
Let's Get Wellington Moving
Zero.
Is getting huge amounts of money out of
The highest aspect of that is the roading tunnels that you support.
and the light rail, which I don't support. But the issue is, is the money being put back into the roading network? And our priority will be to ensure that the funds that come from road users go back to road users to ensure we're building and maintaining the roading network. That has to be the number one priority for that fund.
You are going to take money out of that fund to build the roads of national significance, right? So then are you going to top that up for maintenance?
So there's maintenance is an allocation. There is state highway improvements, and we will also provide a capital allocation as well to assist with building new roads. But also, we have said in our policy document, we're very clear that whether it's tolling, value capture charges, other user-paid charges which can assist to help build those new roads need to be looked at as well, so that those who use them and benefit from them are contributing towards them.
Would that essentially be a new tax? You guys are all about no new taxes, but if you're doing targeted rates, that's a new tax.
Well, if a road unlocks, tens of thousands of greenfield houses, and there is significant increase in the value of that property due to that land being unlocked because a road is built, there should be the ability for the Crown to be able to recover some of that funding to help pay for that infrastructure. Even if there's a farmer who's been in that area for 40 years, you're more than happy to put a targeted tax on them just because you want to build a road there. When the development happens and that money is made, we need to be looking at value capture. And I think there is that is something which I think you'd find there's relatively broad support, but the principle is around those who use it and those who benefit should be contributing towards that infrastructure. Okay, while you got the microphone, Simeon, a question that's come from online. Will the National Party scrap the clean car fee bait? Yes. Okay, wonderful. Are there any questions from the floor? There is one down here. I'll grab a mic for you. Thank you.
So we've talked about interventions and incentives. Where do you see the role of the ETS in helping to decarbonise, and where do you see that going?
Great. Let's start with Labor.
Sorry, I was a bit distracted. You said where do we see the ETS go?
Yeah, so where do you see the role of ETS in helping us to decarbonise for the future?
Yeah, I think it's...
Use your mic.
It's critical. I think that's probably a really simple answer. Yeah, I think it's really important, and we've all got to stick to it, and it's got to become apolitical, this stuff.
It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. And particularly when it comes to vehicle fuel efficiency, we know from all the data that people make decisions and companies make decisions about which vehicles to import, not based on fuel efficiency, unless there are standards in place or price incentives. So we can improve the efficiency of the fleet through things like a fee bait and the Clean Car Standard, and then that benefits people in the future because they don't have to spend as much money on petrol, they don't use as much petrol. If we tried to rely on the ETS, what would happen is people would get less efficient cars now, and then later when carbon prices go way up, they'd be hit with with bigger fuel bills. So that's why all the countries in the world that have successfully reduced emissions from their vehicle fleet have used policies exactly like the Clean Car Standard and Clean Car Discount. That's what all the evidence is around the effectiveness of that. And we also know the marginal abatement cost when it comes to reducing carbon is negative because the society benefits from spending less money on petrol, and they're driving as much, and we've reduced carbon. So positive economic benefit for consumers, and no cost to government.
Simon.
Well, Kiwis who drive petrol or diesel vehicles, light vehicle, already spend about $10 for their emissions every time they fill up. So if the people in this room didn't know it, that's what happens under the ETS. The emissions trading scheme not just sets a price on emissions, but also sets a cap. And I think New Zealand's annual emissions are currently capped at about, 76 or 80 million tonnes. So if a government wanted to reduce emissions, it would simply reduce the cap on emissions every year. ACT says we should do that in line with our top 5 trading partners. We shouldn't be out in front leading with our chin, imposing a whole lot of costs on industry, on households and on business. What we should actually do is have a carbon price that actually allows New Zealand to transition at a reasonable rate. Net zero 2050 sounds like a good target. Let's get there. But there's no point in adding cost to Kiwis' household budgets. And if you think about how it's going to be solved, Transport Committee, I'm pretty sure Julianne was sitting on that committee when the manufacturers came to Parliament and told us that between 2025 and 2028, they're retooling all of their manufacturing in Europe and Asia to produce nothing but low emissions vehicles. So Kiwis, you can tax yourself all you like, but we'll sort it out. Just give us a couple of years.
Simeon.
Yeah, so our view is that the emissions trading scheme is going to have to do the heavy lifting in terms of it caps and it reduces over time the amount of emissions and it prices it, and that will flow through. And I think the reality is we could have all sorts of policies in place to try to do various things. I mean, the clean cars, the scrappage scheme the government was thinking about, it was going to have a cost of something like $1,000 a tonne to emit, to reduce 1 tonne of emission.
It was $133,000.
Oh, 133,000. Okay, so
4,000 tonnes for $569 million. So Labour knows how to waste money.
So the point there is have a price signal, use the price signal, and let the market and technology drive the change.
Wonderful. Let's just, we haven't talked about strong, fair markets. I'd like to talk about a grey area within the Consumer Guarantees Act, and this is around dumped vehicles. This is when someone takes their car to somewhere to get repaired and essentially dumps it with the mechanic, and the mechanic actually can't do anything with it. They can't scrap it, they can't sell it for years because the owner might come back and claim the ownership on that. Are you guys aware of this law? And we'll start with you, Simon. What would you do with it?
Well, it sounds like a real problem for small business. I don't have a solution for it. ACT doesn't have a policy on that, but would be really interested in getting the feedback from the industry how to solve that.
Helen.
Yeah, I read about it in your document, and it was something that we didn't have any work on that I know of, and it's interesting that that's an issue. Yeah, keen to hear more.
Simeon.
I agree. I guess the solution, I'm not 100% sure what that solution may be, whether that's having a time period whereby if a car is in your possession and it hasn't been collected and you've done various things, that you then have the ability to act upon that. That's something which need to be worked through to make sure that it's fair and reasonable, but clearly it's a significant imposition on small businesses which is unfair and certainly needs to be addressed. So happy to work with the MTA on that issue.
Julian, Genter, I mean, do they have this issue with bikes as well? Like I mean, it's not taking the piss.
I'm not sure. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. Probably not. Bikes tend to have a really long lifespan, and lots of people are picking them up and recycling them and repurposing them. I'm aware of a whole lot of community organizations that are doing that, repurposing old bikes.
I saw some video the other day. No.
But yeah, sounds like something that is worth looking into. If the current setup is not fit for purpose and is not covering all of the issues, then we need to look at that.
Great. Now, in terms of time, it's 13 minutes away from 8 o'clock. You guys have got to get back to Parliament,
We're
don't
going
you?
to be in big trouble.
Are you? You're all going to be in big trouble?
Yeah.
Which is fantastic. Last
It's
question.
all right. ACT's going to repeal the Three Waters reform. So even if they pass it tonight, it's going to be all good after October 14.
Well, just a very quick question. This has come in a question emailed from some members earlier. The right to repair legislation is passed in Australia. This allows pretty much independent mechanics to access some data sharing so they can actually fix these cars that prevents the big dogs from dominating the industry. Do we need something like that here? Simeon, we'll start down the end with you.
Well, not fully across that particular issue. If it's happened in Australia and it's working, I think one of the things we do in New Zealand is we think we have to reinvent the wheel every time, but actually, most countries have solved most problems, and if that's working over there, we open to having a look at it here.
Helen?
Very interesting. Came across another issue which is quite similar. Most countries, if you want to repair something, you can repair it without breaching copyright. And here we would hold people to the copyright, so it stops a lot of repairs. So you can't kind of reverse manufacture something. That I have talked about making into a private members bill. I think it'd be a great private members bill. So if I'm still here in a few months, I'll be drafting that.
Good luck. Julianne.
So, yeah, absolutely. The Greens have a support right to repair in our manifesto.
Oh, lovely. Simon.
There's actually a petition for right to repair before Environment Committee right now. We're considering what Environment Committee might recommend back to government. But there's definitely an issue around access to data so that repairers can get on with the business of fixing it, because otherwise there is essentially a restraint of trade or a limiting in how efficiently this work can be done. That has to be balanced against people's property rights as well.
Lovely. There's also the MTA promised to give some questions to the MIA, Fed Farmers and EMD. I know Fed Farmers has already had your question. Would the EMD or the MIA like to ask questions, or have you already asked them? Yep, we've got one for you. Great. Let me bring you a mic. And I'm sorry for getting you guys in trouble, but it's going to be worth it.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Amy from the MIA, and I'd like to ask a question. You've all outlined your individual policies, but what's left hanging, I think, is to what extent coalition agreements might likely result in policy variations and what is not up for negotiation.
Let's start with you, Simeon, because this may happen.
I don't think any of us can answer that.
Well, you can give it a crack.
Well, look, we're campaigning on our policies and asking for your party vote for National so we can change the government. It's the only vote to change the government and get New Zealand back on track. And inevitably, what happens after the election, if we're in a position to form a government, the other parties will negotiate on those issues. But the reality is our policies are very clear on a range of these particular points, and I think if we're in a position to form a government with ACT, I think there's a lot we can work together on.
Labor, compromise, are you happy to?
Yeah, it has to happen. It's our system, and it's a good system because it means that more people get things that represent them. So I'm keen on compromise. I don't think that there is any reason to avoid that. It is a good reality that you all get to vote and you get a bit of what you want.
Julie and Genter, you guys had to compromise quite a lot with New Zealand First. You end up with some half-baked ideas.
Well, I encourage you all to look at the Green Party's major priorities for this election. So far, all of the ones that have polling on them show over 60% support amongst all voters. So what the Green Party is campaigning on is mainstream, it's practical, it's proven, and it's forward-looking to address the real issues of our time. And I don't think enough voters realize just how pragmatic and practical Green Party policies are, how solution-focused. But I encourage you to look at our website, look into it, because most people's values are with people and nature. We want to live in harmony with those. That is what's at stake.
Simon, you've got some pretty bold policies, getting rid of Waka Kotahi, creating a whole new company with two different arms or something like that. So
Yeah,
you're going to have to compromise.
Well, so here's the deal. We go around the country asking people what they want. What they say is they want real change. We're polling at over 13% last night's poll. That's 17 ACT MPs. In a coalition with National, that gives us a quarter of seats around the cabinet table. If we get more party votes, we have more influence. If you want to see real change, not just switching a red captain or a red Chris for a blue Chris, then we'd urge you to give your party vote for ACT. When it comes down to the negotiation, no one goes into a negotiation telling the other party what their minimum acceptable position is. I'll leave that for the boss.
Wonderful. Is there anyone from the EMD here with a question? No? Okay. Anyone else with a last question? Okay, fire away. Stand up, big loud voice. Let's do it very quickly.
Tony Johnson, LBBTA, probably a quick one. Look, there's quite a lot of concern about this big focus on electric vehicles, in case you hadn't noticed, from a safety point of view and a efficiency point of view. Do you folks have any forward thinking around hydrogen as a solution into the future, as well as EVs, or instead of?
Let's start with you, Helen.
Yeah, it was a point I tried to make earlier. It's really important we're agnostic and that we also allow these things to thrive. So there's been a lot of work with, I think it's Hiringa, and building a network. They're based on, they were actually from Todd Energy, quite a few of them, and they've come in and tried to build a network. There's a real focus with hydrogen on those big heavy vehicles, because obviously the transfer of energy into hydrogen's quite, it uses a lot more energy, but when you bring in hydrogen into that sector, there seems to be a lot of potential in it. So the idea is that government stays neutral to the type, but actually enables a whole lot of things to happen. And who knows where we'll go in terms of the technology.
Simeon, have you got a hydrogen policy at National?
Well, again, it's about actually the industry is going to be developing solutions which are zero emissions, and that's what we're seeing is being built. We're seeing electric vehicles, we're seeing hydrogen vehicles. That is ultimately we need to be. We're a very, very small part of the global market when it comes to vehicles. And we need to be open to bringing those vehicles into New Zealand. Now, I think the key thing with hydrogen is around making sure you've got the electricity, the abundant electricity available to be able to be produced, to produce the hydrogen. We've released a policy, Electrify New Zealand, which helps to unlock all the barriers which are in place to build renewable energy in New Zealand. Currently, it takes on average 8 years to get consent to build a renewable energy plant in New Zealand. 8 years. It takes an average 2 years to actually construct it. So we're taking forever just to get consents when actually we need to be doing the building, so we've got the choices that we need when it comes to electrifying our economy. So we've got a policy on that which helps to unlock all of those barriers and electrify our economy.
Julianne, you guys love green hydrogen?
Like realistically, I don't think hydrogen is going to be the solution for the light fleet. It's just too much electricity loss. You know, it takes too much energy, and EVs are probably winning the race in that respect. I really recommend this guy Saul Griffith. He is an entrepreneur and engineer who was recently in New Zealand because he's launched Rewiring Aotearoa. They did Rewiring America and Rewiring Australia. He's Australian, and he's written a book called The Big Switch, and he addresses really clear language, the opportunity of electrification of the economy, of electrifying all the machines, and lays out why hydrogen will be really important for manufacturing green steel, green manufacturing of steel, which we will need for renewable electricity and things in the future, and it's possibly with heavy vehicles or shipping or sustainable aviation fuel. I don't know if the safety concerns around EVs are merited, but if so, like definitely government should be working with industry to make sure that people's concerns are addressed early on.
Very quickly, Simon.
Yeah, well, the government's about to chuck $100 million at trying to subsidise and stand up a hydrogen industry in New Zealand. There's no government or country in the world to subsidise an industry into being. They're competing against $380 billion that Joe Biden is throwing around under the Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, that's a crazy thing to call it. In the UK and the EU, they're throwing hundreds of billions of euros at this kind of activity. We could just simply wait for the tech to get here. You look at H.W. Richardson, a trucking company in Southland, they're already fitting essentially hydrogen boosters to existing new diesel trucks. They're getting fantastic emissions reductions. Their customers are paying when they run on hydrogen because they want a low emissions product. They want to be able to tell a customer they're delivering a low emissions product to them. All of this stuff can be solved by industry and by users. It certainly won't be solved by government.
Wonderful. We've got to leave it there because you guys have got 3 minutes to duck down to Parliament. You're going to be in trouble with your whips. Thank you very much for coming, all of you. We do appreciate it. That is Simeon Brown, Helen White, Julianne Genter and Simon Court. And thank you all very much for coming. I think they turned your mic off, Simeon. Hope I didn't get you in too much trouble, but thank you all as well for coming because it's important that we engage in politics and get involved. So your questions were wonderful. Your online questions were great. The pre-ones were great as well, and the questions from the floor were fantastic. And thank you to the MTA for having me. There's lots of drinks at the back. I don't know if there's any canapes, but feel free to hang around and mix and mingle.